Alright, this is Synthesis 112. This is our first class. You should have in front of you two sheets to begin with. The first one is the class schedule for this course, and you'll see that we are covering in our Bible survey 1 Samuel to Song of Solomon. We have a couple of floater classes down at the end because I'm sure we'll probably miss one or two here and there. And we hope to spend 4 classes on each of these first 2 books in our study. You'll also note that down on April the 11th, 12th, 13th, and the 18th, there are 4 classes set aside for Proverbs. Now, if you'll just hold on to this sheet and go over to the next sheet, which is your assignment schedule, and look down under Proverbs, it says, make up your own complete set of synthesis notes on this book following the format we have used in our class notes. Alright, just as I asked you to do that for the book of Ruth. By the way, I don't have your notes on Ruth. Yeah. Just as I asked you to do it, Ruth, I want you to also make up your own notes for Proverbs. I will be giving you notes, but I expect this to be an assignment. 6 weeks test of this course. Back on the schedule is February the 7th. We'll be having our 12 weeks test right on schedule, March the 23rd, or hopefully too. Alright, I want to explain a little bit about the assignment schedule first. As in our previous course, as we work through these books, in other words, we have 4 classes dedicated to 1 Samuel. By the end of these 4 classes, I'd like you to have the first assignment done, alright? And to have read through Baxter's commentary. Okay? And that's the format that we'll follow all the way through. I've tried to pick something practical from each book, something that either I have to do myself yet, or that I think that you should know simply to have a proper knowledge of each of these books. For instance, 1 Samuel is really a study of the life of Saul in a large measure. The whole book almost revolves around this man's life. So if you're going to do a biographical study on Saul and chronologically list all the things that happened in his life as recorded in Scripture, and then analyze his character spiritually, then really you would have an understanding of the book. So, same thing goes for 2 Samuel, 1st and 2nd Kings. In 1st and 2nd Kings, I've asked you to do a chart of the kings and the prophets of the United Kingdom first, and then in the second book of the divided and single kingdom periods. I'd like you to do that from your own study. I don't care if you compare it afterwards to your own charts in your books and so forth, but I'd like you to go through the list yourself, make it up, right? If you didn't already know it, 1st and 2nd Chronicles repeat the historical chronology of 1 Samuel through 2 Kings. Alright? Basically what you have at the end of 2 Kings is the exile of the southern tribes. Alright? You have the end of the you have the end of the divided kingdom. Now you just have you have the end of the single kingdom at the end of Kings. Now these books were written from a somewhat different perspective, and what I would like you to do in 1st and 2nd Chronicles is compare the historical record of the previous books to these, just to see how different and how alike they are. Right? What differences? Does 1st Chronicles and 2nd Chronicles, do these 2 books give you additional information or less information? Right? Stuff like that. Ezra. and Nehemiah, I'd like you to compare the chronologies of these two books and do a biographical study on each one of them. Give you a choice of Ezra or Zerubbabel in the first one, and Nehemiah in the second one. All right, a biographical study of Esther. Job is I asked you to do this one because I've never done this myself, and I think that you need to if you're going to understand the book of Job. You'll recall that the majority of the book of Job is really a discussion between him and his three friends, right? Eliphaz, Zophar, and Elihu, is it? I think so. Elihu. So what I'd like you to do is to summarize what each one of these three fellows said about Job's condition if suffering. I've never done that myself, but I've heard it preached, and I think that it probably will be a profitable study. I only want you to do two things under Psalms. Research the authorship. I don't know for sure what you're going to find. It's been so long since I did it. Right? But I know that all the Psalms weren't written by David. I've heard that some of them were written by Moses and others. I think that would be a useful thing to know, which ones are written by who, because of widely different periods of time. Right? It's obvious that Psalm 106 and 105 were written by Moses because they take you through the wilderness period. That's it. The history of the Jews. Also, the classification of the Psalms. You have messianic psalms, you have historical psalms, you have worship, liturgical psalms, and so forth. So I'd like you to bone up on the classification of psalms. Ecclesiastes. What's the world outlook, the religious viewpoint of this man? Summarize it. And then the interpretations of the Song of Solomon. One of the most difficult books in Scripture to understand. So I'd like you to find out what are the different ways people look at this book and compare them. All right? Any questions? Good. Everybody understands?
We're all in agreement.
Yeah, we're all in agreement. By the way, Ken, if you have any objections, just knock. Yeah. All right, we're going to go ahead with 1 Samuel today. I'll pick up with our regular class format in our study. If my head sounds like it's in a barrel of water, it is. Excuse me for a moment. All right, the title of the book, 1 Samuel. Well, Unger says that the book was, these two books were named after, first of all, the fellow that was the principal character in the first book, and he was the one that anointed the two principal characters in the following book. You may have or may not have known that the title of this particular book, along with its following book, are not always the same in the various manuscripts. In the Hebrew manuscripts, there was one book called Samuel. Right? Or it was simply known as the Book of Samuel. The Septuagint called this book the First Kingdom. So the books of Samuel in the Septuagint were called the First and Second Kingdoms. The Book of Kings were called the Third and Fourth Kingdoms. Okay? So they divided them up into periods. The Latin Vulgate called it First and Second Kings and Third and Fourth Kings. And by the way, I don't have a strictly King James oriented Bible. I don't know if that one behind you is a King James Bible or not, whether it gives the full title, but the subtitles in the King James called First Samuel the first book of Samuel, and then First Kings was called the third book of the Kings. Okay. So it was really considered to be just one of the books of the Kings. Right? First, Second Samuel, First, Second Kings were just called the books of the Kings, sort of. Right? Kyle and Delish, who are standard authorities of the Old Testament by virtue of their commentary, their Hebrew commentary, point out this is the most appropriate title for the book because the first book, that is the first half of Samuel, contains an account of Samuel's life. And the spirit of Samuel it pervades the second half of the book. He basically says the same thing as Unger. When does Samuel die? In relation to the chronology of these two books. All right, something like that. Probably a little earlier than that. Did Saul begin to reign at 1050?
He married to David, right?
Oh, I see.
10.
Yeah.
10 years after.
Yeah. Okay, that's not bad. As far as the chronology of First, Second Samuel, David wasn't anointed until 2 Samuel, right? Chapter 7 or something like that. So, Samuel dies in the second book. Not in the second book, but according to the record of the second book. Alright, authorship of the book. Schofield says the author is unknown. Unger says that the author may have been Samuel. He could have been a joint author with Nathan and Gad. According to 1 Chronicles 29:29, it sort of relates Samuel, Nathan, and Gad together. 1 Chronicles 29:29. Now the acts of David the king, first and last, behold, they are written in the book of Samuel the seer, and in the book of Nathan the prophet, and in the book of Gad the seer. Now, whether this means there were three separate records, or whether there was one book that they all three participated in, it's hard to say. The higher critical view, which Unger rejects and says doesn't have any support, is that this book contains all kinds of varying traditions and somebody just added it together, as you would, standard view, just about. It's not really what it appears. Unger adds that the old Jewish tradition was that Samuel wrote the book. He says what you can certainly acknowledge is that even though we don't know for sure who the author of this book is, it certainly has uniformity of character. When you put 1st and 2nd Samuel together, there's obviously a plan and a purpose, which indicates it was probably one compiler, probably a prophet under the kings who lived at the time. He probably used documents left by Samuel, Gad, and Nathan. So what Unger is saying is that it could have been Samuel, but there's nothing really wrong with saying that it wasn't Samuel either. Right? J. Vernon McGee says that Samuel is considered the author up to 1 Samuel 25, which records his death. And that Nathan and Gad completed the writing. All right. The date of this book, both its writing and contents. The book of 1 Samuel was written probably about the 10th century BC in the non-critical view. Unger says that the date of this book cannot be any later than the end of David's reign, probably written just before his death. For example, in the 27th chapter is a reference to the division of the kingdom, so obviously the book, at least later portions of the book were written after the division of the kingdom, under Solomon's successor. That's interesting. That references 1 Samuel 27:6 that says that Ziklag belonged to the kings of Judah down to the present time. 1 Samuel 27:6. Then Achish gave David Ziklag that day. Wherefore Ziklag pertaineth unto the kings of Judah unto this day. So apparently they're able to date that particular event, right? Obviously there's been a fair amount of passage of time. Now having said all that, Kyle and Delish add that in general the contents and style of this book point to the earliest times after the division of the kingdom. There is no allusion to the decay of the kingdom. There's no reference to captivity. There are no Chaldeisms in the actual Hebrew of the book. So it probably was written or compiled through a period of time up to the division of the kingdom, or shortly thereafter. And Baxter says that the contents of this book cover a period of about 115 years. I just wondered if it gives us Samuel's age when he died. 1 Samuel 25. Is it 1 Samuel 25 that talks about Samuel's death? I thought it was later.
Yes, it is.
Oh, there it is. The first verse. No, it doesn't give us an age at which Samuel died. That would have been helpful. Or could have been. I suppose before we leave the dating of the book, we should mention the higher critical view. The documentary hypothesis theory concludes that there were two sources. A 10th century source, J, an 8th century source, E. They were supposedly united, and then later, about 100 years later, the 6th century, the Deuteronomic editor deleted portions of this formerly united book, and then they were subsequently restored. And I think some of the reasoning behind this view is that there apparently are duplications. It's alleged that some of these events are recorded more than once. Yes, sort of thing. All right, important people in the book. Do you know anybody in the book of 1 Samuel? Besides Samuel.
Eli.
You sure? In 1 Samuel?
Yeah.
All right. Anyone else? How many sons did Eli have?
2.
What were the bad ones named?
I'm just sitting there and 2 then, eh? There's one Phinehas or something.
You're thinking of
Aaron's.
Aaron's.
Oh, I know you had 2.
Okay. Hophni and. I can't remember that. Hophni and. Hophni and. Oh, yeah, you're right. Hophni and Phinehas. Who were Samuel's parents? Remember their names? Elkanah and Hannah. His father was a bigamist. Did you know that? He had 2 wives. Remember the story? Hannah's competition. He beat on her, made her feel bad because she never had a son. So she went to the temple to pray. Her name was Penina. Penina and Hannah. But he was a godly man. So there you go. All right. Who were the major enemies of Israel during this period? See, quite a few references to them throughout these books. Philistines, right? Remember, they stole the Ark of God. Or Israel rather lost it in battle. That's right. In this book, the 8th chapter, there's a turning point. Something happens. They have not rejected you, but they have rejected me. First 8 chapters of this book are still the old theocracy, right? Samuel was raised up by God to lead the people, judge the people. Samuel is the last of the judges. And who did Israel choose? Saul. He was a head taller than all the rest. They figured he was a good choice. Apparently a shy individual. He's rather reticent to take up the reins of authority. What tribe was he from? This is one of the reasons why he was rather shy. The smallest tribe, Benjamin. Right? His father's name was Kish. Alright, so... And did Saul eventually have any sons? Yes. Who were they? They form a subsequent part of the story. Saul wanted his son to resume the throne after his death. Huh? No? That was a prophet. This fellow was a bosom buddy to David. Caused all kinds of problems. David and Jonathan. Alright? So Jonathan was son and heir to the throne, at least humanly speaking, but because of his father's rebellion, that's recorded in 1 Samuel 15, to obey is better than sacrifice, remember? Rebellion is as the sin of witchcraft. Pretty good lessons in this book, you know. By the way, he had more, I think he had, there were more children that he had. I thought he had either another son or a nephew. Who is the fellow that was crippled? Remember that he was crippled because his nurse picked him up and they ran out and fell, or was dropped? Mephibosheth. And David befriended him after Saul's death. Remember? Fed him, brought him into the court. I don't remember if he was a son of Saul or a nephew. But anyway, I'm not even sure if he's mentioned in this book. I think that's the next book, yeah. Anyway, Jonathan is probably mentioned in this book, yeah. In the conquest. The people form a large part of the story. The people chose Saul. The people rebelled against the Lord. The people joined together in battle. You have various individuals, the men of Kiriath Jearim. You have the men of Jabesh Gilead. Local groups of people. Oh yeah, sure. So, Saul did have other children. Jonathan was just one of his sons. He had a daughter. Remember he offered to David when David slew the Philistines? His name was Michael, or Michelle. I don't know how you pronounce it. Sure, then we have the Philistine hero, Goliath, right? And he was only one of the sons of Gath. You have the story of Nabal. the worthless individual. By the way, there's a real play on terms there. The Hebrew word for worthless, I preached on this one time in the book of Proverbs. I think about the 5th chapter, it has a little homily on industriousness as opposed to worthlessness. And the Hebrew word for worthless is naval. And that's what this guy's name means, worthless. But he was that by character too. It's rather interesting. It's a good study. So, David gets a wife through his contact with Nabal. Remember her name? She came out with, loaded up all the donkeys with food, came out and met David on the road. Abigail. Right? You have several famous warriors that joined David's outlaw band mentioned in this book. Abishai and Abner. There's a few specific enemies of Israel mentioned in this book. Over and above just Philistines, specifically you have the king of, where did I see that? King of Gath, king of Moab. Did I mention the king of Achish? So there's a lot of Bible stories that come out of this book. We'll pick up with the geography of the book next class. Yeah. Please forward the tape to the end of this side, Ken, and then it'll be ready for another class.